Hello and welcome to Staying Ahead of the Curve. I'm Jeff Snyder, Vice President, Senior Consultant with Camac Retirement Group. And today we've got a very special episode. It's an Election Day episode. I'm joined today by the former Assistant Secretary for the Employee Benefits Security Administration, Mr. Bradford Campbell. Brad, thanks for joining us on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get into the election, this is our Election Day special, but before we get into that election, I know you were at the Department of Labor under President Bush, and I want to get your perspective on the new 403B lawsuits that were launched probably about a month ago now.
Yeah, so over the last 10 years, we've seen several waves of fee litigation, and the latest seems to be directed at 403B plans. When I was at the Labor Department is when we started changing the reporting requirements to require sort of the full 5,500 filings from 403Bs. And part of the reason we did that was really we were finding that there were similar violations and issues in the 403B world as there was in the 401k world, and we needed better reporting to do that. And I think what we've seen in the enforcement activities that the Labor Department was engaged in then is that not every 403B has been as careful about their fiduciary process as they ought to be. And so one of the things we've been doing for our clients is doing reviews of that process to make sure they're up to speed. And I think this litigation is an example of exactly why that's important. 403B plans that are subject to ERISA need to be run in accordance with ERISA standards, and that's not always been the case. And I hope that this litigation doesn't result in a lot of problems, but I'm also not necessarily surprised that that's an area they've now turned their attention to.
Well, certainly more to come. I think we're all interested to see how this all kind of shakes out and the next steps. So
Indeed.
It's going to be very, very interesting beginning in 2017. So shifting gears, Brad, I want to talk to you a little bit about the election. You've obviously been on the inside at the Department of Labor, and this is a pretty big election. I don't know if you know that there is an election going on.
I've seen some commercials about that.
Yeah, just a few. But I wanted to get your perspective first on the election, but also as a former Assistant Secretary for the EBSA, your perspective about the agenda. I know we just had the new fee disclosure regulations. Not fee disclosure regulations, but the new fiduciary rule regs. And I wanted to get your perspective about what we might expect to see in 2017 and beyond from the DOL.
Yeah, and I think whoever wins the election is going to bring a very different perspective to how the rule is finally rolled out. Sort of we're in the phase right now of where the rule goes into effect April 10th of next year. If Donald Trump were to win, I think it's likely that date would be extended rather rapidly while they consider what else they want to do. If Secretary Clinton wins, then I suspect we're continuing forward, certainly, as she's indicated her support for the rule. But how much what's the right word? How much reasonableness is there in some of the enforcement accommodations and some of the interpretations and guidance? One of the challenges with this rule is, even though it came out last April, and we're now 7 or 8 months into the phase of trying to comply with only a few months left till April, we still have no guidance from the Labor Department to help us through some of the holes and ambiguities and uncertainties with this new rule, which is a major revision of the law. So we really need that guidance, and we haven't received it. In addition to just delaying it, there's probably a real difference in what those two administrations would put out in terms of guidance and how they would file down some of the rough edges that the rule has, and maybe even whether they would file down some of the rough edges. So I would anticipate with Secretary Clinton, we're in a very similar position, and potentially even, well, it's very hard to predict. Will she be more or less reasonable than the current administration in terms of its implementation strategy? There's an argument on both sides of that for Secretary Clinton.
Well, we're not going to put you in a spot and make a prediction, but talking about the agenda, beginning on January 20th, 2017, we have a new president. We're presumably going to have a new Department of Labor and administration. What do you see on the horizon in terms of the agenda?
Well, in terms of big picture policy, one thing that worries me about the Clinton administration is some of their policy advisors are advocating a much more government-centric approach to retirement savings. And I think the strength of our system has been its private sector nature and the fact that it's not government making those decisions, that the investment decisions are made by individuals and fiduciaries out in the real world rather than on their behalf by the government. And so things like the facilitation of these state-based payroll deduction IRA programs like the Secure Choice program in California, I'm very concerned that the federal government is essentially abdicated its responsibility on what has traditionally been a federal-only area, and has now introduced 50 different state regimes potentially into this. And I think for the next several years, frankly, if it weren't for the fiduciary rule, which has occupied so much of our time for obvious reasons, we would all be spending a lot of time talking about this payroll deduction IRA situation because of the potential it has for disrupting how companies offer plans, the potential disincentive it may offer to small businesses to offer 401ks, and the long-term effects of that in terms of reduced retirement savings. On the one hand, there's some greater access because obviously some portion of workers don't have access to a plan at work. On the other hand, a payroll deduction IRA is not as good as a 401k plan. I would rather that as a government they had made the decision to facilitate greater access to 401ks rather than sort of have the Labor Department just by regulation let the states start doing whatever they wanted in this space. And I think we're going to have some concerns about that in the long term. You know, what investments are there and sort of political issues in the states about that, what the fees are, how it applies to different businesses in different states. There's a lot of reasons to be concerned about that. And I think that's a long-term agenda item we'll spend some time thinking about. One other, of course, and this is not an exciting topic for anyone, but it's actually really important, is the revisions to the Form 5500 that have been proposed in this administration. And again, talking about a reporting form is not exciting for anybody, but there's some real significant changes on both the retirement and health side that need to be fleshed out. That could have some long-term consequences as well.
Well, I guess we're just going to have to wait and see what November 8th brings for us.
Indeed. It really is going to matter for our issues here. Well, I think it'll matter for a lot of issues, but retirement savings is one of those areas where it will.
Well, Brad, thanks for sharing your time today. We appreciate you coming on the show today.
Happy to do it. Thanks.